it very quickly, the boulder rolls down that hill and builds and builds and builds. So, I'm anticipating a late budget, but hey, I've been surprised before.
Hi there, it's WAMC News Director Ian Pickus, and on this episode of the WAMC News Podcast, budget talks in Albany go down to the wire. Well, we're in the final days before the start of the new fiscal year on April 1st, and New York Governor Kathy Hochul and fellow Democrats who control the legislature appear to be at odds over a number of issues, including housing, criminal justice, and tuition, to name a few. So the question is, will the budget be late for the second year in a row? For analysis, I called up WNYC Capitol reporter John Campbell. Here's our conversation. What stood out to you as being different from Governor Hochul's budget proposal in the one House budget bills released in mid-March?
Well, what stood out to me is that the Senate, the Assembly, and the governor are far apart on a lot of issues. The Senate and the Assembly, they're kind of in line. They're both controlled by Democrats, and the governor's a Democrat as well. But, the Senate and the Assembly, they want to raise taxes on the wealthy. That's something that Governor Hochul has opposed. They all want to increase funding for the MTA, the public transit system in New York City, but they all differ on how they would go about doing that. They are very far apart on the issue of, say, charter schools. The governor wants to change the charter school cap so that more can open up in New York City right now. That's something that lawmakers in both houses pretty strenuously oppose at this point. So the big thing to me is that there is a gulf in between the governor and the legislature at this point, and we are just days away from the budget deadline.
Is this year unusual compared to previous years? Because there's always disagreement between the legislature and the governor. That's why there's a couple of months between the budget proposal and the new fiscal year.
Yes and no. I mean, last year there was a pretty significant disagreement about bail reform and the governor's efforts to kind of pull that back. Bail reform 2019, the legislature and then Governor Cuomo passed a law essentially ending cash bail for lower level offenses and most misdemeanors, non-violent felonies. And that's really been kind of a controversy ever since, particularly as crime rates went up during the pandemic. Now, there's no real clear link to the bail reform legislation and that increase in crime, but nonetheless, it's been a major topic of debate. And last year, Governor Hochul at the last minute kind of slipped in a proposal where she wanted to make it easier for people who are arrested in multiple times in a short period of time to be able to be eligible for bail and some other things too. And she insisted on that being in the final budget. And she got some version of that, but she had to hold the budget up 9 days late. And, when she's been asked about it this year, she has pointed to last year and said, hey, I've been willing to do it before. And she suggested that she's willing to do that to get what she considers to be must-have items in her budget. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that again this year. I'd be much more surprised if we see an on-time budget because, as I said, there seems to be a gulf between the legislature and the governor at this point.
Well, specifically, what further tweaks to the criminal justice part of this does she want in this budget?
So the governor wants to get rid of what's known as the least restrictive standard for serious crimes. These are the violent felonies, the felonies that are the crimes that are eligible for bail right now. And in the law, as she describes it, there are two kind of competing interests. One, a measure that says that, sure, you can hold people on bail, you can consider the idea that you can consider their past domestic violence arrests, you can consider their past gun use, things like that. But also in the law is a part that says you have to impose the least restrictive means necessary to ensure somebody comes back to court, essentially. So she claims that those are kind of competing interests, that different judges in different parts of the state interpret it different ways. The judiciary does kind of pushes back on that a little bit and says, no, nobody's really misinterpreting that, but there seems to be some confusion. The governor is painting this as a way to clear up that confusion, get rid of the least restrictive standard for the violent crimes, the bail-eligible crimes. But lawmakers are pushing back. Democratic lawmakers, they really do not like that idea. They say, it should be the least restrictive means necessary to ensure somebody comes back to court. And they say that bail reform has actually worked as they intended and needs time to breathe and grow. They're pushing back. You see the public defenders pushing back and claiming even that this could be unconstitutional to rescind this least restrictive means standard. So that is one of the major points of contention, and that's one of the reasons why I think it would be quite a surprise if they get a budget done on time.
Well, we already saw the legislature, specifically the Senate, rebuke Hochul once during this session in the high-profile defeat of her pick for chief judge. Who's got the leverage here as you see it?
Well, I mean, there's any number of leverage points, right? The legislature has flexed its muscle recently. The Senate, in particular, they turned down Governor Hochul's pick for chief judge. That's the first time that's ever happened since the system for confirming the chief judge was implemented in the 70s. So they really flexed their muscle and said, hey, we're a separate branch of government and we are going to exercise our right here. That said, the governor has tons of leverage in the budget, most notably if she wants to hold it up and keep it late, because if the budget's late, lawmakers have their paychecks withheld. So lawmakers don't like not getting paid, as none of us would. So she could hold it long. Lawmakers could see a pause in their paychecks. I mean, they would get that eventually once it's passed, and that's a huge leverage point if she wanted to use it. But that also could further damage her relationship with the legislature. Now, everybody, all the legislative leaders and Governor Hochul, they're all saying the right things. They're all saying that they have a good relationship, good working relationship. They get along. But at the same time, there's always this tension, and tension in some ways is good. I mean, that it's a system of checks and balances. That's how it's supposed to work on some level, but you also need them to work together to get a budget done.
At what point does late become a pressing problem for New York state government? Separate from the issue of the lawmakers being paid, were there any implications for the operations of Albany when last year's budget was, I think, 9 days late?
Yeah, so it's not like the federal budget, right? We see these federal budget fights over the years where there's a deadline, and if they pass that deadline, then there's a federal government shutdown, and federal parks close, and we've seen those fights play out over the years. It's not the same on the state level, but when the real implications come into play are when state workers need to get paid, because that is something where you will need budget authorization to pay those workers. You need money to pay those workers. There's hundreds of thousands of state workers across the state, and they do not take kindly to delays in their paychecks. So there's a period of usually a few days, depending on where the budget deadline falls in the pay cycle, where lawmakers really do need to get something passed before then, even if it's a temporary extension to ensure that state workers get paid. And that really kind of tends to be the real budget deadline. It usually falls 3-4 days after the actual budget deadline. And that's really when you're going to have to see something happen, even if it's just a temporary extender bill, as we call them.
We had on the Assembly Minority Leader Will Barclay in recent days, and he was warning against the size of the budget. Governor Hochul's proposal was for $227 billion. Do you think it's likely that the final package, whenever we get it, will be more than that?
I mean, it's possible, but it wouldn't be much more, right? I mean, they come together, they agree on the Senate Democrats, Assembly Democrats, and the governor. They come together in what's known as the mothership in Albany parlance, where they meet jointly and they agree on, this is how much money we have to spend, this is how much revenue we're budgeting, this is how much we have for this, and this. So it's possible. It certainly wouldn't be less than what the governor is proposing, $227 billion. But sometimes you see it come a little bit more if, say, the Senate and the Assembly's revenue projections differ from the governor's, and they can convince the governor to go a little higher. I mean, sometimes you see that, but I wouldn't anticipate anything radically different from the $227 billion that the governor already proposed.
Let me end by asking you about Governor Hochul's housing compact. This was one of the key focuses of her budget and calls for 800,000 new units to be built around the state. And that plan has met with some local pushback in some areas of the state. Where does her housing plan stand in these budget talks?
Well, the governor has said it's one of her very top priorities, but at the same time, that's another issue where the Senate Democrats and the Assembly Democrats both rejected her plan. They all say they want to increase housing. They all say that housing is at a crisis level in some of New York State, including New York City. And they all say they want to work toward that goal, but where they disagree is on the issue of local control. The governor's plan sets these housing targets, 3% in downstate communities, 1% in upstate communities, meaning in the governor's plan, those outside of the MTA region. And if they don't meet those goals, individual cities, towns, villages, the state can then step in and approve multi-family apartment complexes without local approval. So they could override local control, and that is something where, particularly in the New York City suburbs, including some of WAMC's listening area in kind of northern Westchester County they're really pushing back. You see a lot of local officials. They were at the Capitol last week with local control, not Hochul control signs. I mean, they are pushing back on that very hard. They do not take kindly to any area where local control is infringed upon. So you saw the Senate Democrats and the Assembly Democrats kind of back off of Governor Hochul's plan in their one-house budgets. But again, this is another issue. How hard does Governor Hochul want to push on this? And is she willing to hold up the budget until she gets what she wants? I mean, that's something that we're really going to be watching for as we go forward.
And your expectation is it'll be a working weekend, April 1st, 2nd, and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm gearing up for. I mean, and then once you get past that, then soon you're running into Passover and Easter, and then maybe a few days late becomes a couple weeks late. And, it very quickly, the boulder rolls down that hill and builds and builds and builds. So, I'm anticipating a late budget, but hey, I've been surprised before.
WNYC Capitol reporter John Campbell, as always, thank you for taking the time and for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, that does it for this episode of the WAMC News Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Ian Pickus.